Thank you for joining us for this important discussion and conversation this evening. I am Carol Mason, the president of John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And as I promised in my June statement to the John Jay community following George Floyd's death, we are convening this panel tonight to examine how we should be educating our future leaders, educators, public servants, and law enforcement officers to prepare them for a new world where we no longer have incidents like what has happened in Minneapolis, Kenosha, or Louisville. Our Black Student Union took the lead in beginning these conversations in early June and brought together a powerful number of voices, including our own John Jay faculty members, Chief Chuck Ramsey, who was the chair of the 21st Century Policing Task Force, and a strong advocate in the form of Shaun King. Two of the many things that resonated with me in that town hall in June is that we can find common ground when we make a commitment to engage in conversation and to stay in the dialogue across the perspectives. And that's what we're going to do tonight. Secondly, the town hall validated my strong belief that John Jay is poised to lead the country through these difficult conversations and chart a path forward for the country because of who we are. We were founded in the mid-1960s as a police college in response to a similar time of social unrest. John Jay was created to educate police officers so that they would be better partners with the communities they serve. And one of our panelists is an alum of John Jay. 50 years later, we continue to be focused on using research and evidence-based approaches to educating a new generation of police officers and leaders who will partner with the communities they serve and who themselves will be fierce advocates for justice in their communities. We designed tonight's forum to reflect on where we are 6 years after the death of Michael Browne in Ferguson, Missouri, and in the context of the current reckoning with the killing of George Floyd. And unbeknownst to us, when we originally planned this program, we did not know that we would have the added weight of what happened Sunday in the shooting of Jacob Blake. As a community focused on issues of justice, we're committed to providing a space to explore these complicated issues through our racial justice series. Our goal is to seize this moment in history and to promote lasting change. When I use the term moment, I hope that this is a pivotal moment, not a moment in terms of that we will talk about it today and forget about it tomorrow. What I want to see is us leading the conversation to long-term sustainable change in how our country addresses racial inequities. After the senseless killings of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, and in light of recent events in Louisiana and Wisconsin, it's hard not to be paralyzed and have a sense of hopelessness or helplessness about race relations in this country. It would be easy for us to shake our heads and hope that someone else provides the solution to these problems. But the fact that you are here tonight, nearly 250 of you right now, but almost 500 registered for tonight, but the fact that you're here is what gives us optimism, that we are all committed to doing the hard work and dealing with these issues. So tonight we're going to discuss the intersections and implications of our country's complicated history on race and law enforcement. We're here to reflect on what we've learned from Ferguson and what still needs to be done. We're here to examine what efforts have been made to create trust between law enforcement agencies and communities of color and other marginalized communities, and to try to build those positive interactions. We're here to chart a path forward for our country. To truly advance the cause of racial justice, we need to fully acknowledge where we've been and recognize how we got where we are today. Because the only way to shape our future is by understanding our past. Before I introduce our incredible panel of experts coming from a broad range of perspectives, I want us to reflect on a quote from Dr. Stephen Covey as we proceed with this discussion. He said, "The actions of any police officer in an instant can impact an individual for life and even a community for generations. Given this realization, every police officer must be centered on what is important: service, justice, and fundamental fairness. These are the foundational principles in which every police action must be grounded. So let me give you a little bit of ground rules about tonight. If you've got questions, put them in the Q&A, and then someone will get those questions to us through the conversation, and we'll reserve some time toward the end of the hour for questions from the audience. So we're going to start. I'm going to introduce the panelists, and they are going to speak and introduce themselves to you in this order. First, we have the Honorable Benjamin B. Tucker, who is the first Deputy Commissioner of the NYPD and a John Jay alumnus. Next, we will hear from Isaac Bryan, who is the Director of Public Policy at the Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies at UCLA. Next, we will hear from our own esteemed Gloria Browne-Marshall, who is a John Jay Professor of Constitutional Law and a civil rights attorney in her own right. And yes, you have seen her on TV. And finally, we will hear from our esteemed colleague, David Kennedy, who is also a John Jay Professor and the Director of the National Network for Safe Communities. So with that, we'll start with Ben.
Well, good evening, everyone. Carol, thank you for the invitation to join the, as you described, the esteemed panel. I'm proud to be among my colleagues here, Isaac and Gloria and David. Just a little bit of background on me. So I am the first step at the NYPD, and I joined this department 50 years ago. So we're having a conversation like this for me is really something that first of all is stunning to me that we're having the conversation we're going to have in light of Carol's comments about Mr. Floyd and Mr. Blake most recently, and certainly Michael Brown 6 years ago. And I could go back, and the names and the list is 10 times longer than that over this 50-year period for me. In any case, because I've been in this business for so long, and because I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and experienced the kinds of challenges with police as a young teenager, I can certainly say that I've lived these challenges that we have to deal with, and the discussion tonight is welcome because it seems like I think at this moment in time we are this conversation we might be at the point finally where Carol said she hopes it's a pivotal moment. I would suggest that it has to be a pivotal moment where we take the reins and figure out what efforts are needed for us to really come to grips with the challenges that we're facing and the lives that we're losing, and we really don't have a choice in that regard. And so I look forward to the discussion this evening, and hopefully be able to share with you some of my experiences and some of what I've been involved with here at the NYPD, where I came back to return to 6 years ago to run training as part of a new administration under Mayor de Blasio, and he and Bill Bratton, who was his commissioner appointed at that moment. And I came back to the department at Bill's request to run training for the NYPD. And I came back in large part, I left my job in Washington, D.C. at the White House Drug Policy Office, because I watched what was happening here in New York. And with respect to the stop and frisk debacle that took place in the prior administration. And as a result, saw an opportunity to really bring my experiences and my expertise to New York City, to the town where I grew up, and to the city that I love, to really think about ways in which we might, in this agency, as the largest police agency in the country, take steps and engage in a reform effort that might make a difference. And so I'll leave it there, Carol. Look forward to hearing from our other colleagues and to the conversation that I hope we can have later on in this session.
Great, thank you, Commissioner Tucker. Mr. Bryan.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you, Mr. Tucker, for sharing that. I'm so honored to be here for a number of reasons, and I'm honored to represent the West Coast. My lived experience with policing is much like Black men and Black people across this country. I've been pulled over unnecessarily. I've been pulled over at gunpoint unnecessarily. I've been asked to step out of the car. I have been handcuffed. I have 8 brothers who have gone even deeper into the criminal legal system. And so as a scholar, I've rooted my studies in looking at the criminal legal system and the youth justice system and the penal system and trying to understand some of the root causes that lead our communities to such frequent interactions, but also to understand the historical foundations that set up these institutions, right? I don't believe that our criminal justice system and our policing models are broken. I believe they were designed this way. And history tells me that they were designed this way. And so continuing to study these, I've worked at the intersection of academic research, community organizing, and municipal decision-making, looking at what racial profiling looks like, working with the DOJ, the ACLU, and other organizations to try to figure out what an equitable policing model can be and should look like. I love the synergy between the West Coast and the East Coast when it comes to our policing, because Commissioner Bratton came out here under a consent decree following the Rampart scandal here in Los Angeles. And so we have shared leadership, we have shared tactics, we have shared personnel. And as a result, we have shared lethal experiences in our Black communities, in our brown communities, in our poor communities, and in Los Angeles and our indigenous communities. And so I'm really glad to be here because I think, like Deputy Commissioner Tucker said, this can't be a hopeful moment. It has to be a catalytic moment, one that we never forget. And it hurts to say that because out here in Los Angeles, Rodney King is one of those moments that we're not supposed to forget. And we haven't forgotten, and yet here we are again. And Michael Brown, this event tonight, reflecting on 6 years post-Ferguson, we were not supposed to forget Michael Brown or Freddie Gray or Sandra Bland or Laquan McDonald or Eric Garner or the countless others across this country. And yet here we are again. But I am hopeful. I'm hopeful that through these conversations, through the leadership that we can put in place and through the movement, right? More people have been out in the streets now than at any point in our country's history, including the civil rights movement, right? This movement can't just be a moment. It has to be a commitment. And so I'm here tonight in solidarity and in commitment with all of you. And I'm grateful that you're all here. So thank you for having me.
Thank you for being with us and making sure that this is a national conversation that we're having. So Professor Browne-Marshall, you are next. You're muted. You're muted.
For having me. I thank you for having these wonderful panelists, and I express my concern and my hope that, as Isaac has pointed out, this goes beyond a mere conversation because the issues are too grave. There are those who are in this audience who, for this panel, it will shed new light. This is the beginning of our semester in John Jay, and I love teaching here. I've been here now going on 2 decades. I appreciate those who have come because they want to learn something new. Some have come because they want to have some suspicions affirmed. But there are others who are in this audience who do not believe there's a problem. There are others who teach here who do not see anything wrong with the shootings that have taken place of civilians by law enforcement. They continue to rationalize and these rationalizations continue to believe that we are the ones who are wrong for even looking at police officers with such scrutiny. They believe the protesters are wrong for protesting the behavior of police officers. I think that it's important for us to understand that there are those who believe the police officers are correct and that there should be no extra scrutiny, that qualified immunity in civil cases is perfectly fine as a legal tenet. and that reasonable force has been used in every single one of these cases, and that it's okay for this nation, this shining light on the hill of democracy, as it calls itself, to kill over 1,000 civilians a year. That it's okay for the racial disparities that we have witnessed throughout the country's history to continue. The criminal justice system is the only major system in this country that has not had any deep reform around the issue of race. We've had it around education, housing, jobs, so many areas, but not the criminal justice system. And let's just say, and I'll touch on this very briefly because I like to talk about legal history, that this nation was formed based on the landing in Virginia in 1607, that the Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619. We had a year-long commemoration of the African arrival. We know about that in New York Times, the 1619 Project. But it was by 1640 that we already started to see the disparity in race relations in the criminal justice system with the case of John Punch, P-U-N-C-H, John Punch. By 1669, the Virginia House of Burgesses had already passed a law saying that it would not be a felony to kill an African. 1669. We have a criminal justice system that has failed people of color, failed the Native Americans upon whose land we sit. It's failed us. And yet, for everyone here, we are still debating this issue as though there is some angle to this we've missed. So I want to turn and end with this quote from W.B. Du Bois, who was a civil rights activist. He was a graduate of Harvard. He was born in 1868. And this Black man said, "A system cannot fail those it was never meant to protect." We've got to reform the system so that it protects people equally. I'm not asking for more justice. I'm asking for equal justice. And I hope we'll have more time to talk about that from a legal perspective. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Professor Browne-Marshall. And lastly, we'll hear from Professor David Kennedy, who again is the director of the National Network for Safe Communities.
Thanks, Carol. So I am David Kennedy. I'm a professor of criminal justice here at John Jay. And as my boss has just said, I run the National Network for Safe Communities here at John Jay. I care about communities. Communities need to be safe. There is no institution, community, family, school that can function and thrive if it is not safe and if people do not feel safe. And I am sitting here today because 30 years ago, in the height of the crack epidemic, I started walking Black and brown neighborhoods all over the United States where people were afraid to go outside, where there was street shrines to the dead on the sidewalk and RIP written on the buildings. And those of power and privilege and elected and appointed were not keeping those communities safe. And I've been working at that ever since. I've been part of developing a portfolio of work that is sometimes transformative in producing that kind of public safety. And in all of that work, police have been involved. And so I have a deep appreciation for what good police and good policing can mean. You cannot be in those neighborhoods, you cannot be in that world. And to Professor Browne-Marshall's point, I would like to think you cannot be in the nation and cannot be an American without recognizing the extraordinary toxicity that police and the law and the criminal justice institutions of this country do and have always done. when we talk with working police officers in the national network, we have a shorthand and we say, communities need police. They just don't need the police that they've been getting. And Isaac, speaking from the West Coast, you've reminded me that I was in the room with then LAPD Chief Daryl Gates when he found out that a man named Rodney King had been beaten, and that had been caught on videotape in Los Angeles 35 or 40 years ago now. So communities need to be safe. And part of what that means is not only what outsiders usually think it means, which is that they shouldn't be afraid of each other, they also should not be afraid of their government. And Black and brown people in this nation, and Professor Browne-Marshall, again, to your point, since before there was a nation, Black and brown and other people in this country have been justly, objectively, realistically afraid of their government. One of the things about the recent protests is that a critical mass of white folks finally seem to be understanding this, which I think is really important and may contribute to making this the lasting and transformative moment that it should be. I think to a town hall we had here at John Jay almost 10 years ago, talking about these issues, and a Black John Jay student studying at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice stood up and said, I was in New York City and I was shot. And I called the police. If I had to do it again, I don't think I would do that again. That is a fundamental failure of the American experiment. It is a fundamental failure of our democracy. And since I believe in the American experiment, I believe, as others have said, that we have to get this right. And in a stretch when 10 years of civil rights activity seems to have been baked into about 3 months, I'm hopeful that we can get that done finally.
Thank you, all of you. So I want to begin the questioning with the answer, with the end result. One of the things that I say all the time that makes John Jay special and unique, and why we can have this conversation and why we can help lead the country through this, is that we are educating law enforcement officers alongside the people who will one day, if we don't fix this, protest them. And so my question is to all of you, because I think that we all have, if we had the pen and the ability to design what public safety looks like and what the role of policing would be look like in this world that we get to design without the history that we've had, and we'll go back to the history later, what would that look like? What would you design? And so I'm going to start with our policy person, and I'm giving you time to think. I'm going to start with Isaac, then I'm going to go to Ben, then I'm going to go to Gloria, and then back to David to give you time to process. So Bryan, Isaac.
Thank you for that question. I don't need a whole lot of time to think about that because the way that I think about it, I actually reframe it in my head, and it's not what kind of policing do I want to see, but what kind of communities do I want to see? Or even better, what kind of communities do Black communities, brown communities, poor communities deserve in this country, right? Right now, we have an investment in law enforcement that surpasses our local investments in public health infrastructures, in public housing and affordable housing infrastructures, right? And other key components. Here in South Central Los Angeles, we don't even have grocery stores, but you can find LAPD on every single corner. And so when I think about what public safety needs to look like in our communities, I think we need to build up those infrastructures simultaneously before we question how we can reshape the role of our law enforcement officers. But in doing that, people deserve to feel safe. And that also includes a variety of emergency responders and emergency responses that may or may not require law enforcement at all. We have the largest mental health providers in our country are our jail systems, right? That means our first responders to mental health crises are law enforcement officers. And John Jay is a wonderful, wonderful institution, but you are not training behavioral health therapists. And that's what we're calling on our law enforcement officers to do. And that begs the question, why are they responding to all of these emergency situations for which they have not been trained properly to do? And many would question, I would question whether they ever could be trained properly to do from that institution. An institution that is not rooted in health and care and opportunity and well-being, one that is rooted in punishment by design. And that doesn't mean we can't change that design, but that is the design. And so those are the kinds of things that come to mind when I think of your question. And so to sum it all back and what you originally asked for, I think when I reimagine public safety, I imagine thriving communities. And I imagine civic investment in all of the institutions that keep us healthy and safe, and not just our policing institutions. And I imagine a policing institution that looks significantly smaller than it does now because it's not doing all of the things and solving all of the social problems that it was not designed to do. And I think that's something that we are grappling with as a country, and something we need to continue to grapple with as we look for policy interventions and solutions in this moment.
So again, the wonderful thing about being in conversation with people who you think may not agree with you is when you're in the conversation and you commit to the conversation, you can oftentimes quickly find consensus. So thank you, Isaac, for that, for starting us off, because I don't think any of us would disagree with you. And so I think that Commissioner Tucker, I'm trying not to call him Ben, Commissioner Tucker will tell us that police are being called to do things that they don't want to do, and they haven't been equipped and prepared to do. So Ben, in your ideal world, what does public safety look like, and what's the role of police in that?
Well, I mean, I think Isaac I thought he was in my head because Isaac's comments are what I think about, go to the heart of what I think about often, day to day here. And in fact, as a department, we've been, offloading some of those responsibilities. I mean, he's absolutely right. To look at the wider, widen the lens and look at the public health issues, the public housing issues, the schools issues, mental health, and a variety of other institutions that all have a stake in community. And so for decade after decade after decade, police have taken on increasingly more responsibilities, responding to the kinds of situations that are not really in their purview of expertise, certainly. And though we try to train to that, we have a lot of that responsibility here in New York, whether it's homeless or shelters, trying to help with keep the shelters safe, or police our transit system, or police our schools, or look at how we keep the climate in our schools is a better description, safer. And so that's the challenge, I think, for us in this particular moment. And when you look at all these various components, that to me speaks to, and Isaac referenced it, speaks to not just the leadership of those individual institutions, but to the individuals in the government, whether it's a state entity or the mayoralty, whatever it is, has to be in a position to think about public safety and what community looks like, and what services look like in that context. And so, yeah, we are, as I said, just here in New York, moving away from, as a result of a lot of the discussions and some of the legislative issues that have been put forth, and recently passed legislation that has moved into that sphere to get us out of the business of engaging the public in ways in which we perhaps are not as good as we could be, or as Isaac suggested, maybe it's not an activity that and a response that should be coming from us at all. I think you could debate what that looks like, but we have trained our officers to in a variety of ways to respond to crisis intervention, training to respond to domestic violence issues and respond to and deal with mentally ill people. And we have lots of homeless people in our city, and as an example, and therefore, very often, many of our homeless people also have and suffer from mental illness to some degree. And responding to calls for service to those events is probably not the way we should be doing it. And this goes back to the 80s. I remember Ben Ward making a statement after Eleanor Bumpur's shooting, where one of our officers shotgunned Mrs. Bumpur's, killing her. And I remember Ben Ward taking the position that I'm not sending my cops to those jobs anymore, he said. And he was right, and he had a point. Of course, at the time that he said it, he knew there was no really other alternative. And so the other alternative that we looked at that time was to think about co-response and try to, which is really kind of a Band-Aid approach in some respects to dealing with that. But that's just one example, but that really, I think that example underscores the fact that we need to have the resources, whatever they are, and you have to have the will. The legislative and executive branches of our local governments and state governments, for that matter, have to have the will and the commitment to invest in these kinds of activities in a way that they've never done in the past. And so Isaac's right on point, and I think that those are things that I think are within reach and possible. But they will require coordination and a commitment by leadership in those respective positions to really move in that direction.
Thank you, Ben. So, Professor Browne-Marshall, I'm going to shift your question a little bit because I think I don't think that you or David would disagree with what we've heard. So I want to layer on some other things to think about. Thank you for bringing up Mr. Bunche and that decision and the history. The senior leadership team at John Jay, 55 of us just went through the training with the Racial Equity Institute. So we heard the story of Mr. Bunche and we heard that history. And I know that understanding our history is important to understanding why we are where we are today. And I think that I want people to hear something. Language is difficult, but when we talk about systemic racism, we're not calling people today racist. We're talking about the system and the design of the system and how it was created 400 plus years ago. So, and we're living with the legacy of that. And David, get prepared for me to talk to you about the racial reconciliation work happening in Georgia. So, Professor Browne-Marshall, if you were trying to impact the system so that we could undo some of the things that have put us where we are today, what would you do?
I'm glad you asked that as well, but it's going to go back to the initial question, because I believe the system, yes, like a house, has people in it. The house didn't build itself. The system is not perpetuated by the system itself. People perpetuate the system. And when you go through an educational process, you're educating people or re-educating people around a certain way. So when I've asked young people, and I have high school people in particular, what do you see 40 years from now, 20 years from now as the meaning of freedom? Because our ancestors, putting this in historical context, had a view of freedom that we are living today. That's how we got to be as free as we are right now. Because generations before, white, Black, Asian, Native American, so many different Latinx, they said they wanted to live a free life and they fought for that free life. They protested that free life. The unions that the police officers are in right now were created because their ancestors said they wanted to be able to have a living wage, and they protested for that living wage, and that's why we have a police union. So when we look at what's going to happen by the year, say 2045, when this country is going to be majority people of color, we have to think about what does freedom mean, and therefore what would law enforcement look like And that means the system that we have set up, made up of these people, has to be one in which law enforcement understands that they are government employees. And to some people in law enforcement, that's an insult to call them a government employee, because they've been raised beyond all other government employees to believe they're better than the social worker, better than the people who teach at John Jay, better than any other governmental officials. And they need to understand that our tax dollars pay their salary. They need to understand that people want to have a sense of security, and that we don't take for granted at all that the job is hard, but it's not the most deadly job on the planet. And lumberjacks actually have a job that's more deadly than police officers. But we also know that there are criminal consequences and consequences, deadly consequences that can come from being in law enforcement. I would look at a system in which we have not just a training and an educational background, but we have to also look at a system in which we have people who have, and you don't want to use the word racist, but they don't see people of color as equal human beings. And I'm going to give this very quick example. In April of 2018, I spoke at the State House in Indianapolis. I spoke about race and slavery. I spoke from, one generation to another, as I do. In my book, Race, Law, and American Society, I cover this arc. I had a gentleman, a white gentleman afterwards, say to me, he was told by his religious leader that Black people do not have souls. And he didn't say this angrily. He said this matter-of-factly. He was just saying, he's like, I just wanted to talk to you about that. This was in April of 2018. We just had a white child, 17 years old, Kyle Rittenhouse, shoot people in the streets in Wisconsin. He was told, you've just shot people. They told the police, he just shot people. He had his hands up and walked through the middle of that street with an AK-15 semi-automatic rifle across his chest, and he walked in the midst of police cars. No one stopped him. No one said a word to him. And you can watch the video yourself. It's available. We're not talking about just a system. We're talking about people who are acting and reacting, some with racial animus, some are part of paramilitary organizations, some do not believe people of color are people and deserving of a life. And those same people who would gun down a person of color would allow a white person carrying a weapon to walk right by them. So we can look at changing systems. I agree with that. But we also have to recognize that these systems are populated by human beings who have a certain mindset about other people. And until we have deep reform of this particular system, and that means the people in that system, like a person like Officer Chauvin, who was teaching those younger officers how to terrorize Black people, those 3 younger officers, 2 of whom had only been on the force as active members for 48 hours. He was teaching them, despite his education, despite the training, to terrorize Black people by using a big Black man as an example. That's not just a system. That is a human being doing destructive things and abusing the power they've been given through the government using our tax money. So this discussion needs to go beyond the system itself and actually talk about people who are populating these systems.
So we are going to get to later a conversation about who are we recruiting into the policing and how are we equipping and preparing them for policing. But I want to say, and David, I'm coming to you next, that we are an institution that is fortunately equipping a large number of people who are going to go into law enforcement. And so we have an opportunity at John Jay about how we are equipping these young men and women who are going into policing. And I want to say for the record that I recognize that most law enforcement officers in this country do it right, do it well. But unfortunately, that's why I read that quote from Covey. One incident can impact generations. And so with the proliferation of social media, which Isaac, get prepared to answer a question about the power of social media. with the power of social media, those one incidents, those series of incidents are magnified, and they drown out the voices of those who do it right. So David, I know that you're doing some work in Georgia, where a police chief in LaGrange, Georgia, overheard a conversation with in the hallway of his police department, where two older black women pointed to some office pictures on the wall in the police department and said, "Yeah, those are the people that killed our people." And Chief Dekmar didn't understand what they meant. And so he did some digging and read into the history and realized that the LaGrange Police Department was complicit in the lynching of their relatives. So David, talk about what Chief Dekmar and the state of Georgia has been doing to try to help equip young officers who come out saying, "I didn't do that. That wasn't me." But help us understand how that chief understands how that impacts their ability to police the communities.
So I think in one way or another, maybe everybody who's spoken here has spoken about America and has spoken about history. And the simple, clear, empirical fact of American history is that it is an unbroken arc of the use of the government. Again, Professor Browne-Marshall, you are right. Police officers and people in criminal justice work for the government. They are the government. They are the state. And their actions and the laws of the nation have been an unbroken arc of using the law and the power of the state to do harm to people of color, as well as any number of other harmed peoples. But America's history with especially Black people is special and specially awful. And those are the behavior of institutions. The nation did that. Its institutions did that. And harmed peoples recognize that. It is not, and again, Professor, you're absolutely right. People do these things. But the people who've done these things have been doing them for hundreds of years. They have been creating the history that harmed peoples have lived. And we've been talking a lot about awful incidents. One of the most important lessons I learned early on in understanding this is that when something awful happens, when the police do something awful, white folks talk about the incident and Black folks talk about history. And that history is awful. And one of the bright spots in all of this is that there is a growing realization amongst at least the better police leadership of how true this is and how important it is. And that if they don't recognize it, own it, name it, and address it, that no amount of what people usually talk about as reform will possibly work. The training, the selection, the police athletic leagues, the barbecues, all those things we talk about cannot possibly get to that awful reality. And when Lou Dekmar, who President Mason just referenced, brought some chiefs together in Georgia, and we talked about this, one of them said, I've been doing the barbecues and the police athletic league and none of it's working. And you've just reminded me that in my town, not all that long ago in collective memory, the sheriff rode his horse up the aisle of the Black church on Sunday morning, turned around and said to the Black worshipers, still astride his horse, "None of you will march with Dr. King when he comes to town next week," and rode his horse back out of that church. People remember that, and they remember all those moments and all those harms. And what Chief Dekmar did and what others are doing and what my office is supporting them in is a frank process of reconciliation and truth-telling. What has happened in this country is no better than what happened in South Africa under apartheid. They just had the backbone to recognize it. We have never recognized it. And we still haven't recognized it as a nation. But what we're seeing in LaGrange and in a number of other places around the country, and when President Mason was at the Justice Department, she supported this work, and we did this in 6 cities around the country. An explicit named engagement with the community around this history of deliberate harm, the naming of that harm, the acknowledgement of it, the documenting of it, the opportunity for those who have been harmed to tell their stories and name their own experiences, and critically to teach those on the job now how real that is and how that has shaped the communities they police and has shaped their role in the eyes of the community. And if I had an aspiration here, so Carol said, what sort of policing do you want? Whatever it is, I want an anti-racist policing. I don't want reform. I don't want nibbling around the edges. I want an institution that gets up every day to protect its citizens, informed by an understanding of the reality of what has happened and what has gotten us here.
Thank you, David. And I just want to piggyback and just give one specific fact about what happened in Georgia last August. I am from Atlanta. That is still home to me. I just work in New York is what I say. We had 20 plus police departments across the state of Georgia, including the Attorney General from the state of Georgia, come together for 2 days. They did the homework and the research and found out what families they were responsible for or complicit in the lynchings of, brought those families together and had a 2-day session. They apologized to those families for what they'd done and then talked about how we move forward. You know, I as a Black American whose family grew up in the South, that was powerful. It's one step. It's not the panacea. It's not the answer, but it is a recognition of how you build community and how you change the dynamics with a community. So one of the things that we hear talked about today, I'm coming back to you, Ben, is the encounters, the nature of encounters that people have with policing, police departments. So to prepare for this conversation and something I'll tell you about at the end of this program, I've been having some conversations with one of our faculty members who, I won't name him, but David and Gloria Browne-Marshall will know who he is. We have very different political perspectives, but we share a mutual respect and willing to have the hard conversations like we're all doing today. And I told him my vision for what I'm going to announce at the end of this program. And we had this conversation, and within 20 minutes, we agreed on at least one common principle that we all can accept as a paradigm that we ought to think about, or framework. He didn't want me to use the word paradigm, framework for how we approach these issues. And that is the sanctity of life and the sanctity of everybody's life. And so the question I want to pose to you, Ben, and the others to respond to later is, I think we need a reframing of how we prepare our officers when they encounter the public, and when is it okay for them to understand, just walk away? And when is it really important to engage in things? We talk about de-escalation. I think that we ought to be walking away from situations before they get to the point where you have to think about de-escalating. I'm interested in your thoughts, Ben, about how do we reframe and rethink about the encounters and the expectations of encounters with the public from our officers. You're muted. Okay.
Okay, that's a great question, Carol. And this issue is an issue we've taken on and struggled with within the department, because you hit, that's the heart of, in many ways, what police work is all about. It's what do these encounters between a police officer and a citizen look like, and what is the dynamic, and we all know that they can end terribly, terribly bad. And they may start out what might seem to be really innocuous and end up in a different place, that is not good for, the outcome may not be good for the citizen, or may not be good for the officer, or both. And so we actually looked at, from a use of force lens. Through that lens, we revamped our use of force policy. We focus on and train to this notion of sanctity of life. We actually use that in our descriptions, and make sure that officers think about what that really means in the context of when they raise their hand to take the job as a police officer, what that's all about. And so you can begin with that kind of discussion. And you mentioned de-escalation. We've taught that since 2014, and made it a part of our procedural justice conversations about fairness and equity and so forth. And more recently, trained our officers, the entire patrol force, in implicit bias, just from the point of view of making them aware of the fact that we all have these biases. Because we've been speaking about race and racism, but biases are a lot more subtle to some degree, and not as overt as racism and racist behavior, but nevertheless is a problem, potential problem, and comes into play when officers are engaged in these encounters and do exercise their discretion. And what we expect is that they'll exercise that discretion properly. And so I think it all comes back to training in many ways. And I know I hear a lot from folks when I speak about training, that and they will say, well, training, but we still end up with these terrible situations. And I say, I suspect that we will always, unfortunately, have difficult situations, and what we want to do is minimize those. And the way we can reduce that and the possibilities of those things happening, I think, is through training, is through supervision, is through accountability, and it is through the culture of the organization as well, and what that culture will withstand. I mean, when we look at and think about some of the shootings that we've seen recently with the murder of George Floyd, and even the more recent events that we referenced earlier with Mr. Blake and others, in my view, as a someone who grew up in policing and spent my career trying to address the very things we're trying to talk about, that we are talking about, you don't make those or take that kind of action and lightly. You take it, if you take action like that, you're taking it believing that it's okay. You're taking it because you perceive and know or believe that you can do so, and you're not going to be held accountable. You can have that AK-15 or rifle around your neck, and you can walk through the crowd with your hands up and not be touched, because the culture allows that to happen. And so, I think so much of what we're talking about, it has to do with the culture, both within police agencies to some degree, but also in the jurisdiction at large. Certainly will have an impact on the actions and so forth. And so it may point to a lack of training, or it may point to simply that, that there's what the message is that a new police officer entering a police department is taught or sees, and even if his or her training was terrific, if they had it in a post or not within that particular agency, when they arrive in that agency or in that assignment, then certainly they are expected to conform, perhaps, and they take their message, take their guidance from the more senior officers, and if that senior officer happens to be one who does not respect the people and the communities that they police, and does not see them as human beings, as Gloria suggested earlier, then that person, that officer, will more than likely end up as if she or she stays in that department at some point having that same mentality. So yeah, I think we try to do the very best that we can to make sure we, number one, hiring the right people, whatever that means to you and what you're looking for in an officer, as a person who you want, who will be, who will serve the public honorably. And I think by and large, we do a decent job in accomplishing that. But nevertheless, you may, even with all of the prior, the investigations and the reviews of new candidates, and then as they make it through the psychologicals and all of those things, the real question is, are they still, have we missed anything? And you never know that until something goes awry later on down the road. So, but I see your point, Carol, and I think you're on target. And I think if we focus on that notion and remind people not only the sanctity of life, but also to police officers, remind them of why they took these jobs and the nobility of the work that they're being asked to do. We can get, in the majority of cases, we will have people who understand what their role is and who understand how to interact with the communities in ways that honor, their oath and honor our Constitution and toe the line with respect to, being equitable and fair in everything that they do.
Thank you, Ben. So I'm coming to you next, Isaac, but I was looking at some of the conversation in the chat, excuse me, the Q&A, and I want to make sure that people understand that this is a first in a series of conversations that will take place in many different contexts. And one of the things that we do want to do is have a conversation with our current students who are going into law enforcement and our alumni who are line officers, to have a conversation with them about how they're navigating and experiencing what's happening, what they're thinking, and what they wish we would do at John Jay to prepare them for what's happening in the country. So I want to assure people that again, what we have to do is stay in conversation. This is 400 plus years in the making. It is not going to change after this 1.5 hour discussion today. But Isaac, you have the policy pen. Going back to my question to Ben about how to give more context for officers about what kind of rules you would have around how they encounter the public. What would you design from a policy perspective?
There are many policies that are in place that are even above those of the individual line officer. So I'm going to touch on a few things, and I think Deputy Commissioner Tucker hit an excellent point about training. You can design the most robust, innovative, informative, culturally competent training that we have to date. But if new officers are being overseen by veteran officers who are telling war stories about how things really are done, this is how we really do it, or this is how I've done it in my experience, and you'll learn this when you get out there a little bit more, those kind of trade-offs, it undermines any kind of good training you can implement. And we've seen that in department over department across this country. And that's something that's very difficult to change because veteran officers carry so much status in the department because of its hierarchy and because of the strength of the police unions and the negotiating power that makes it very difficult to get rid of the bad apples, as we would call them, or the problematic officers. I know chiefs around this country who have had to fire the same officer many times over, right? Because they then go to a tribunal of their peers or some sort of constituency that reviews the evidence and has the ability to undermine a chief's ruling, even when a chief has decided to fire you for misconduct. We have some states, including California, where if you're fired from a department for misconduct, you can still go work at another police department, irrespective of that. I'm thinking of Tamir Rice, right, and the officer who shot him. And so there are many, many policies that need to be put in place, including policies around use of force. Professor Browne-Marshall mentioned earlier about when shootings are reasonable. That's too low of a threshold. There's a necessary threshold that's been implemented in some parts of the country, and some folks believe that that is not even enough, that we need de-escalation protocols put in place. We need many, many, many protocols before somebody can fire a weapon on somebody. I think we've got to look at this from the ground up. And part of it is a cultural thing, and it's hard to create policies around culture, especially when that culture has been baked in to the fabric of the institution. Our policing institutions were designed to protect the property rights of property holders at a time when Black folks were considered property, right? And even today, Black folks have less property than others, which is why we see such a deep connection between poverty and race and poor policing outcomes in our criminal legal system. And so when we're looking at the policies that create a more equitable policing institution, we have to match that with the policies of broader society that increase opportunity for those communities that are currently coming into contact with law enforcement at a higher rate.
Thank you for that. And you touched on a lot of things. And what I hope our audience gets is that there's a lot of homework for you all to do in terms of understanding how the laws were designed to create the situations we have right now. Isaac was talking about that that people of color don't own property. And there's a book you should read, The Color of Law, because it was forbidden for FHA to give loans to people of color to be able to buy homes that created this generational wealth.
President Mason, since we're mentioning scholarship, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Whiteness is Property as well, a book written by law professor Cheryl Harris here at UCLA, talking about how even just whiteness itself is viewed as a property right by our civic institutions and manifests that way. So that's another required reading for those of you watching. Whiteness is Property by Cheryl Harris.
So if
and of course, my book, Race, Law, and American Society.
So I'm coming to that. I was going to say, we have the ability in our chat to be careful when you do it, to put that in the chat for the audience to see as well. So I was coming to you, Professor Browne-Marshall. So put those books in the chat, somebody. I won't do it myself because I'll mess it up and send it to the wrong place. But I do think it's incumbent on folks to really educate yourselves.
That is.
Be able to have these conversations. So beyond educating ourselves, Professor Browne-Marshall, I was glad you spoke up because I was coming to you. People are engaging in this conversation because they want to know what they can do. What can they do? And I'm going to give you an example of a friend of mine who's on the phone watching this, and I'm not going to call her name. But she and her husband just moved to Greenville, South Carolina 1.5 years ago. And so she's gotten engaged with the local commission there and is helping them design what their use of force policy should be. As a citizen, she's not being paid to do this. And she's invited every single one of them to join this conversation today. What would you say to folks who want to do something? We're asking people not to just sit quietly, but to engage in the change. What would you suggest?
I would look at one, I'm also a proponent for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I have written about that quite often. And when I was very active with the American Bar Association, there was actually a policy passed by the American Bar Association for Congress to create a commission to study the effect of slavery and Jim Crow segregation on the rights of people of color. And so that's also property rights. That would be voting rights and criminal justice system. And in my book, Race, Law, and American Society, I look at, and the reason why I say this, and I've written many books, But the book that I'm putting forward is Race, Law, and American Society. And I know there are people in the policing programs who are reading this book. I've talked to officers about this because some of them had no clue that the policing departments we have today came from slave catchers, bounty hunters, militia formed to put down Native American uprisings, then mixed in the later part of the 1800s, the Bobbies of England. So it was this sense that we are protecting white people from people of color. And that mission that's in the core of our criminal justice system and our policing system has not been rooted out. And that's why I'm saying the criminal justice system has not had the deep type of reform that you have in housing and other education areas and other areas of American life. So I would say that people need to ask their elected officials about criminal justice reform. They need to actually vote for people who are actively seeking to have criminal justice reform. And that would include reform of the prosecutor's office. Because the reason why police officers, as all of us have said, have been able to do this, and I believe, and I've taken criticism for this, I do believe that people generally go into policing to help other people. I believe this. I actually was part of that group that said that John Jay was an advocates for justice. I was part of putting together that mantra for the college because I believe that is true. I also believe that there is a silence within the police department, and that silence within the police department is because there are police officers who are afraid of these rogue police officers. They've said to me, I've had police officers who have been put in positions of insecurity because they've actually spoken up and they've gone to internal affairs and they've talked about these rogue police officers. There's a fear within the police department of other police officers. So this is a culture that goes beyond what happens to us outside, it's also what's inside. But for those people, they have to vote. And when it comes to for example, the prosecutor's office, we're only looking at the district attorney who's running for office. But those are also government employees with very protective unions. And those prosecutors are making decisions in which you have police departments or police officers bringing in people of color without probable cause. There was no probable cause in the case dealing with George Floyd. There's no probable cause in the case dealing with Eric Garner. You have police officers who are acting only on the word of a non-Black person to arrest and bring before a prosecutor. We have prosecutors who can do a great job when it's civilian on civilian crime and become completely inept as far as getting any type of indictment for a police officer, or they bring no charges at all. So we need to talk about who is being elected to be that prosecutor. We need to look at and sometimes complain against those prosecutors who are not doing a good job. We also need to understand that the failure to protect goes as deep as you mentioned lynching. Where were the police officers during these over 4,000 episodes of lynching taking place in this country? We need to think about who's running for sheriff, who's running for for the police commissioner, or if they're being appointed, who's running for mayor, who's going to appoint this person. And this goes back to voting. And that's why voter suppression is such an endemic part of this nation, because they did not want people to vote out that bad sheriff or to vote out that bad prosecutor. They wanted those people to stay in positions of power. I wanted to speak about this one quote, and I want to end with this. And this deals with people being silent and the fact that there are so many white people, the Boston bomber, for example, the Aurora shooter. There's so many white people commit mass murders, and yet they walk free without, and I don't mean walk free without punishment, I mean walk free to stand trial, where we have people of color unarmed who are gunned down because police believe I'd rather be judged by 12 than carried by 6. And yet we only have maybe 40 cases in which police officers have actually gone to trial. So this fear for my life seems to be the panacea that police officers use. But I also want to, as I said, go to this idea of silence, because the people on the outside, and I thank these young people for protesting. I thank them for putting their lives and health on the line in the midst of pandemic. to actually make sure that this country realizes we're not going to just sit still and be murdered. And the changes that are taking place, why must Black people die to make change in this country? That is wrong on its face. But the silence of the good people is disturbing me. The silence of people who sit back and see this happening. And it makes me think of Martin Luther King, who said the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing. And good people must act. Good people must vote. Good people must complain about the actions of prosecutors, complain about the actions of people who are doing things wrong and they see it. They must act. And that makes all of us in some ways an activist, if that's the way you want to look at it. But I think it's also very important for them to read and understand just how deep this problem is and demand action from their local officials. We need to do more than this. We are better than this. And even though other areas of life have had reform, I think people need to understand that, yes, it sounds scary to say defund the police. We do need the police. People might say, oh, lumberjacks may have a more difficult job, but call a lumberjack, when you're being robbed. I know. I truly believe that policing has a role and a dignified role in our society. But I also believe that role has been brought into a place where there's a sense that they are beyond criticism and beyond even our suggestion of reform. That is scary. And we need to understand, despite whomever might be in the White House, the humanistic part of our policing has to return. They need to see that community policing, and people in the community need to ask for community policing and make sure that we understand that we are responsible for each other. And that's the reason why police officers come from the community. And we need to understand, yes, there are bad people out doing bad things, and we want our policing to be one that protects us, but we don't want to be afraid to even call the police when we're in harm's way, because we don't know, as people of color, will the police do more harm than good?
Thank you, Professor Browne-Marshall. So we've got 12 minutes left, and for those wondering about the questions, I am monitoring the chat and the Q&A and reframing the questions in the context of the conversation. So I am looking at what you're writing. Professor Gloria Browne-Marshall talks about accountability, and one form of accountability is in the hands of the prosecutors. But David, can you talk about the procedural justice piece that you were working on through the national initiative in terms of internal and external procedural justice? And then I'm going to come to you, Commissioner Tucker, to talk about what that means in the institution of policing.
Sure. But let me sort of vamp off what Isaac said a few minutes ago, and I'm not going to get this exactly right, but Isaac, you said something along the lines of so much of what's important here rises above the level of the individual officer and the decision that officer makes. And I want to connect that to what was just said about how do we make change, and people just said in a variety of ways. Put pressure on people who have the power to make decisions. And I feel really, really strongly about this. The NYPD not that long ago not only made on the order of 700,000 street stops a year, mostly in New York City's Black and brown neighborhoods, but sort of taught the country and taught the world that the way to produce safety and prevent crime was to flood Black and brown neighborhoods with police officers and do as much policing as they possibly could. NYPD is not doing that anymore. It's an absolutely dramatic change over what's really a very short time.
Since Ben came.
A point I was getting to. Yes, that's exactly right. What's remarkable about that story, I think, and it's important in this context, is that those decisions were made by literally a few people. That incredible exercise of state power with incredible and lasting impact on not just New York communities, but individuals and families, was made by the leadership of the NYPD and essentially by one or two people at the top of that institution in a way that was really ungovernable by anything except the grossest democratic process, right? The people of New York elect the mayor names the police commissioner makes decisions. So there's accountability in that way, but it's accountability that's so high level and attenuated that, as New York City got more and more and more and more outraged by this policy by the New York Police Department, one person basically didn't want to change his mind, and so those stops continued. And then one or two new people came in, and the entire policy of NYPD, with incredible impact on the city and its citizens, changed figuratively overnight. People are elected and appointed to make these decisions. And if they are not made to make the right decisions, bad decisions will get made. And the police as a profession, the police, and the phrase we use, the police stopped all those people. We hate the police. We can't trust the police. Those individual officers didn't make those decisions. They were told to do what they were told to do, and then they did what they were told was their job. And the entire profession is now wearing the weight of that. And I'm glad my friend Ben Tucker is up at the top now, because I have a lot of faith in his decision making. But I worry about the next Ben Tucker and the one after that, right? Policing needs to be democratized in a fundamental way. And maybe, Professor Browne-Marshall, that's another way of saying something you've kept saying, which is we have not reformed this institution. And it's the institution that has the most immediate power in the life of the public, bar none. And as an institution, it has been largely unaccountable, right? That's, I think, just a fact. And then, President Mason, to the question you actually asked, Carol, you're muted.
Get there. Before you go to the other point, I want to push back on you a little bit, because I actually learned this from you years ago before I got to John Jay. While there has not been a legal reform of policing in a global context, you have said, and I've heard you and I believe it, that policing, when confronted, and the reason you're able to do your work is because police departments, individual departments, are willing to do the work to make some changes.
Well, many of them are.
So I don't want people to think as if, and we've worked with lots of chiefs across the country who, when confronted with the facts and the data, realize that they've got to make some changes and are willing to make those changes, but they are not legally mandated. They are by choice, which gets to your point about who leads is important.
So not legally mandated, and often not made requisite in that gray area that is the tremendous discretion that policing and other democratic institutions exercise, where discretion and culture make decisions that are fantastically important. And I just to say what's been said in a different way, I think almost everybody who cares about these issues wants the present national moment not to be a moment, to be something that is a pivot point, that is a catalyst, that continues and has real meaning. And if the energy from the outside dissipates, I'm deeply worried that won't happen. So we need organization, we need activism, we need pressure, we need, as has been said, people to vote. We need new people brought in. One of the reasons that prosecution is changing is because there has been deliberate electoral strategy to put new people in those democratically elected positions. And that is a way of standing up against some of the sort of revanchist energies that are always out there. I think people who are elected and appointed to do the public's business should do their jobs. I don't think, I love that your friend, President Mason, is volunteering. I don't think that the business of democracy should be offloaded to volunteers. We pay people, we elect people to do this work, and they should do the work that the public wants them to do.
They should do the work that the public wants them to do, but the public needs to hold them accountable.
Yep.
And so, you know, you've got to speak up and say when things aren't happening the way that you want in your community. That's your community. You have power, you have a voice, use it. That's what we're suggesting that people do. So we have got 3 minutes. I'm going to give each of you just a rapid one thought, brief, that you want to share before we exit. So I'm going to start with Professor Browne-Marshall, then go to David, then go to Commissioner Tucker, and then to Mr. Bryan, and then I will close.
My one thought is that this is about power. This is about a power dynamic, the power of an individual with a taser, with tear gas, with a deadly weapon. That power that person has in any given situation can end up with a body or an injury of a civilian. And we understand that it's a split-second decision, but we also understand this is a structure in which that split-second decision for some way and somehow can ease back when that person is white and go forward with full force when it's a person of color. We need to understand the prosecutors have to prosecute that officer and let the jury decide whether or not deadly force was necessary or any force was necessary. And until we start having clear delineation in the law as to when an officer can use force, they will continue as they have for 400 years in acting with impunity when it comes to people of color. There has to be a criminal consequence. And we hate to say that, but it's clear as this. If people did not have a criminal consequence for running a red light, how many people would actually stop? In this instance, we need to understand that until we have the deep reform that's necessary, that may or may not happen, we must have criminal consequences for this type of behavior. It's the 21st century. This behavior is wretched. And we are better than this. As a nation, we need to stop. And we need to do all things necessary to end this bloodshed.
Thank you. David?
So I'll go back to something I alluded to earlier, which I really believe. When people are justly afraid of their government, then that is a failure of our democracy. And any sentient American adult should recognize the ways in which the American experiment was founded on racism and racial violence and white supremacy. That is simply a matter of historical fact. That's not the American ideal. The American ideal is lofty and authentic, and I want to believe is honorable. And this is an explosive moment we're in which I think that has been limbed extremely sharply. And if we don't get this right, then that is a failure in the arc of our nation. It's an opportunity to get that right. And I just profoundly, desperately want that to happen and hope that we can make that happen collectively.
Thank you, David. Commissioner Tucker.
Yeah, so I think I'll end by the way I started, and I referenced some of what we were trying to do at the NYPD. I think our discussion this evening has been extraordinary because it is, I think we're all in sync that we know we need to, some type of reform beyond where we are at this moment needs to take place. And I would just suggest that we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And when I think about the work that I mentioned and referenced briefly at the beginning of what we've been doing at the NYPD, and we've been doing it not in a vacuum, but with full disclosure to our elected officials, but also in conjunction in some ways with our national police research groups and operational people, to think about how we move. And so we focused on, David mentioned stop and frisk. We moved away from that type of policing and have managed to also keep crime coming down, even as we shifted from the numbers-driven enforcement to a more precision-based model that focuses on those dangerous people who should be behind bars and not just a dragnet to catch just anyone and then figure out what we do with them later. But we focused on that. We focused on risk management and looking as we work with the federal monitor and the inspector general, the law department and the courts and the public, and all of this around auditing and holding officers accountable and really keeping track of. So it's, in terms of accountability, it's made a difference. And so the notion of risk management, just as they use that focus in the private sector for quality control and assurance, it makes a difference. Of course, the shift to neighborhood policing for us made a difference, continues, I think, to provide some assistance, crisis intervention, an entire overhaul of our extensive, our use of force policies, including multi-classification systems and mandates for in-depth investigations into threat, resistance, and injury, and capturing data and reporting publicly on that data so that it's facing the public and they can see just what's happening with force. And the fact that, as the largest department, we fire our weapons, far less than any other department in the country. I mean, it's, the officers, frankly, in 2018 in this department, 36,000 of them, 5 million stops a year, 5 million radio runs a year, ended up firing their weapons 35 times. 17 of those times were involved, were adversarial. So I give you that sort of summary to suggest that we think we're having a fair amount of success in moving the needle, along with all the other training that I referenced around de-escalation, sanctity of life, and so forth, as well as collaborative policing and that emphasize public-private partnerships to enhance public safety. In much the same way, I think that some of the ideas that were referenced surfaced this evening came about. So just food for thought in terms of where I think we are, just from my own personal experience at NYPD. But there are 18,000 police departments in this country, and so when we think about reform and they have different structures, it will be a heavy lift. Doesn't mean we shouldn't take it on, but we'll need some real clear thinking around just what first of all, what we think our reform should look like, and what the goals and objectives will be. But we certainly should, no matter what, take it on and move ahead. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Isaac?
First of all, thank you, President Mason, and everybody on this panel. It has been the honor of my week to be here with you all. In this moment, I'm thinking about Ahmaud Arbery, thinking about Rayshard Brooks. I'm thinking about Breonna Taylor and the accountability we are still seeking for. In that instance, I'm thinking about all the countless lives that have been lost to a system that has been entrusted with such a lethal responsibility. And in my mind, we are just a little bit past reform. We are in the conversation of transformation, and what that transformation looks like as a country as cities, as departments, as leaders in these spaces, as scholars, something we need to continue these conversations and continue to have deep reflection on. So John Jay, as one of the leading thought producers on this topic in the country, I'm inspired by the fact that we were able to pull this off today and that this is the beginning of a long series. I'm inspired by the 300 folks who stayed with us for most of this conversation and the channels that it'll be continue to be shared on. And I'm hopeful that the transformation that we've been calling for, the transformation that took millions of us out of our homes during a global pandemic to voice our frustration is on the horizon. And I'm hopeful and I'm willing to be a part of it. And I hope everybody who's been here today is willing to play their part as well.
Thank you very much. So I've been teasing an announcement and Isaac gave me the perfect segue. We intend to continue this conversation. John Jay, in partnership with the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, NOBLE, will be launching on September 10th a national conversation on what does public safety look like, reimagining, redefining public safety in this country. Too much emotion now is caught up in the language of defunding or abolishing policing. So I said, let's take it a step back and let's look at what does public safety look like, redefine it, reimagine it, and talk constantly in this conversation about, and then what does that mean for the role of policing? So on September 10th, we will be putting information about the launch, 4 o'clock on September 10th. And then we'll have a series of 5 additional conversations looking at mental health, looking at public safety beyond policing, looking at how we recruit, having these conversations so that we can figure out with voices across the political spectrum, and I say political meaning little p political perspective. We're going to have line officers, union folks, everybody involved, activists, scholars, public health folks, educators involved in this conversation so that we can help the country figure out what do we all commonly agree on, and then give a roadmap for communities to have their own conversations about what their own community should be doing to create this public safety, this world that we all want. Because we all want the same thing. Our Black, brown, white, Native American communities, everybody wants a community where your children have an opportunity to fulfill their dreams. And I believe that with the leadership of the voices of the people in this conversation today, those of you who are staying on this call today, that we can do this. We can do this and we have to do it. I don't want to be back here in 50 years. I don't think I'll be alive, but I don't want Isaac to be back here in 50 years like Ben and I have been back here at 50 years from when we had this moment back in the 60s and 70s. We're gonna get this right. And so I want to thank the audience for your commitment to this conversation, your commitment to this hard work. I want to thank everybody on this panel for having the hard conversations, for showing people how you can say some powerful things that everybody on the call may not agree with, but you can find some agreement to move this forward. And I want to thank everybody for making sure that we are going to use this period in time to make long-term sustainable change in how our communities relate to each other and how we find public safety in our communities. So thank you, everybody. See you September 10th.
Thanks, Carol. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.